Okay. Now watch. This is going to be 5/5/15 LAPD Police Commission just for a flash. And then listen to how they erase the audio of the entire meeting. I just did a video of just 4 minutes before and after I spoke, where you hear an LA City Council function. I don't know when or anything about it. I just have the voices. This is 3217, so here we go.
One aspect is, first of all, the model that Berkeley uses effectively incorporates the opening and closing of businesses, because they look at employment at the industry level. So the feedback effects they get from raising the minimum wage, having a multiplier effect, raising the costs, incorporate the change in effectively in the dying of business and the birth of businesses. So we have the net effects in principle. That said, it will differ, and there's a nice overview in both of the Berkeley and the Roundtable studies by industry, quite substantially, because industries have different labor shares and have different shares of low-wage workers, and they have different ability to raise their prices, and some will really want to be close to their customers, whereas some don't. A low-wage apparel firm with a high labor share may compete in the national markets. They do not need to be close to the customer. They might just pack up and leave. Many other service businesses that are an important chunk of the economies want to be on Wilshire.
Exactly.
That's an important area of concern. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's more, but I know you want to.
You want to? Yes, we'll move around and we'll come back to you, Mrs. Martinez.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. I want to get back to the monitoring piece of the preview. The monitoring of the impacts and effects of the program are important, and you referenced real-time data collection. Can you talk a little bit about what types of real data collection you're talking about, or are you referring to real-time monthly accounting for wage and jobs, or what exactly?
We're very much in the planning stage or thinking stage about this, but there's no hard proposal that's been put forward. But we were thinking between the two of us that, in fact, the ideal type of data monitoring would be a monthly targeted survey of Angelenos, both in the city and county, that we would allow us to gather information and may importantly oversample low-income populations so that and at-risk populations in general. But we don't have any cast-in-stone proposal at this point.
Are you looking at other cities, and how are they doing it? What kind of real data are they looking at?
We're not aware that. Well, we're in discussion with a couple of cities that are currently doing that now, but we don't have any of the details.
We're very much on a learning curve here. The obvious source of data is administrative data collected by the state on employment and wages for establishments. And the establishment address is available, but these are extremely complicated data sources. They are available to some degree with a 3 to 6 months lag, but there are many errors, so they have to be cleaned, and it takes some time. That is a great source of data, and it's available in Sacramento and has been used, for example, by Ed Leamer to think about the monitoring of the minimum wage. This data source could be complemented with city-owned data sources, such as the Register of Businesses licenses, to get some sense of what's happening at the business level. But what we're trying to make clear is that the key piece that is missing from these data sets is, first of all, direct information on workers. What are workers experiencing? What do workers need? And there's information missing on hours worked and the hourly wage. And since the minimum wage is specified and waged by the hour, to know who is affected, whether firms are actually paying the minimum wage, one needs to have some source of information of hourly wages. And there are existing private providers that have existing capacities to run surveys and do so relatively quickly. So if the city wanted, they could be in the field with a survey in May to have first observations on workers in the city and perhaps around the city on their wages, their hours worked, and other characteristics of their lives. And then one could see whether they're being paid more, at what rate, by whom, and what their other needs are.
Okay, so we have a lot to learn from this. We don't have all the information. Okay, great. I want to talk a little bit about the phase-in approach. If the city were to delay the phase-in increase by a year or more, does that help minimize the range of uncertainties because it's a smaller percentage growth in the dollar amount? Or does it make it more uncertain because we're actually looking at a farther implementation date? Or does it do a little bit of both?
It does a little bit of both. Yeah, so you would definitely, wages are going to naturally grow in Los Angeles at all cuts of the wage distribution. So you would expect that it would be a slightly smaller effective minimum wage increase if you delayed, and that reduces the uncertainty because it puts us directly in the heart of the empirical evidence that we currently understand and know. You do, of course, push the implementation further into the future, which adds a little bit of uncertainty going forward as to what the interaction would be with, say, the macroeconomy. How robust is the labor market in Los Angeles going to be 5 years from now? Well, that's more difficult to predict. So you hit it right on the head. That's exactly what will happen.
All right.
I don't know.
Mr. Chair? That's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Perez. Questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, on the sources of the studies themselves, I think the 3 studies each would probably have a desired outcome going in. How much did that track as one would expect in terms of a study asked for by labor and a study asked for by business? How much value did we actually get out of that, and how much of the results were predictable?
That is a very good question. I suspect that's a question that many are asking. Now, we had the benefit of reading the studies up close, and the way we evaluated the studies is to think whether at each step in the process they made reasonable choices. And as we try to reflect, there is a range of choices these studies can do, and we're not going to take a stand on whether we think that the particular choice made was based on the desired outcome. It is useful for the purposes of elucidating the potential range of effects that these studies made different choices, because you ourselves, the public, are aware that making such a prediction is difficult. As we make clear in our report, we find the outcome of the Berkeley studies is very consistent with the broad existing literature, so that gives confidence, especially for sort of somewhat more moderate increases. Right? Both the Beacon and the Round Table are more on the tail ends, perhaps by construction, right? But they help to highlight that there is this uncertainty out there, and there might be these either negative or perhaps even positive effects.
And that's something my goal is to try and pin that down, because clearly I'm a very pro-labor guy. I'm very sympathetic on that side. If I could do a $15 minimum wage tomorrow and it wouldn't harm some of the same workers that is designed to help, I would do that in a heartbeat. But I'm trying to figure out the real results of some of these steps, and do it in the different areas that we need to look at, so we don't cause the kind of harm that some of us fear, and we do the positives that we're trying to get at. So one question would be in terms of nonprofits and what the studies showed in terms of looking at other places that dealt with nonprofits. And there's two problems that I see. One, the ones that are funded by state and federal and local entities, everyone is cutting back in those arenas. So what they would need as we increase the minimum wage is the ability to get more funding, and instead they're probably getting less funding. So that's concern one. The other concern is some portions of nonprofits, some of it's all of it, are funded by private donations. And the question is there, what do we look at in terms of spacing? Because it's not like they're a business where they can figure out how to make more profit right away, but they can make an effort to raise more money, which is something that won't happen instantly. So how have other places looked at those two pieces of the nonprofit world, and how did they respond to that?
Sure. I think the way in which Till and I have conceptualized the nonprofit issue is to think about two types of nonprofits. And this is a very gross generalization, but I think it's useful. One type of nonprofit actually charges a price for the goods and services it provides. So you're a nonprofit hospital, you're a university. I guess it's best that I'm giving this answer since he's from UCLA. And so you can simply, and much of the minimum wage literature talks about the way in which firms cope with the increase in the minimum wages. They pass the increases on through prices, at least some portion of it. Some portion of it is taken up by efficiencies. In other cases, nonprofits have no capacity to pass through via prices. And that's the issue I think is really vexing. You need a place where this firm or this nonprofit no longer has a way to increase the amount of money it's getting by charging more for the services it's providing, because it doesn't charge for the services it provides. Now we need to figure out a mechanism by which we can give them some kind of relief. One way is to work with the state, the county, to increase reimbursement rates. So, but we don't know how politically feasible that is. And another way to do that would be to delay the phase-in of the policy so as to give them some direct relief. And maybe a combination of both that are most effective.
And I'm still not sure how well all of that works. So it's certainly a concern, but I think we want to take that into account, because these are sort of the good guy agencies. Some of the people that work for them recognize that they struggle financially, but they get to do good things for society, so there's a little bit of a psychic benefit for some.
Under the ideal circumstance, maybe passing the minimum wage would reduce the number of people dependent on those services.
One would hope, depending on what it is. And that's a factor in almost everything. When you look at this, you take a step that you think will be a negative, and there's a positive with it. As you said, I don't know that most businesses would suddenly increase their wage to reduce turnover, but there's no doubt that there'll be some reduced turnover from this, and some positive. So there'll be positive and negative side effects. I think we just have to try and anticipate them through this process as best we can, so we do the most good and the least harm.
I was just going to add so on the very first point, both the Berkeley and the Roundtable studies have a very detailed discussion on industries, and which industries they think they are most affected and for what reasons. And we found those very informative and very nuanced. And so I think these studies give ample material to flag potential industries, and nonprofits are among them, especially those nonprofits who have reimbursement rates. So it's not entirely clear that the studies necessarily fall along the lines as you would expect, in that sense that they clearly acknowledge, some industries will be more affected than others. The other thing, existing minimum wage ordinances are all over the map when it comes to the treatment of nonprofits. And our understanding is that more often than not, nonprofits are treated as other firms. But there are some notable exceptions. And the other thing, you mentioned a delay for those that get private funding. Of course, allowing for somewhat of a delay would help these nonprofits to go for other funding sources, especially private funding sources. But we were struck by a point that the Berkeley report raised, that in many of these nonprofits that provide personal services, high turnover is common, and that affects the quality of care, because you'd want your child or your elderly or disabled to have a stable caregiver. And if raising the minimum wage helps to reduce turnover, that might increase the quality of care in certain types of services.
Right, and obviously we'll be happy to see people that supply in-home support services to people, and that thought making more than the pittance that they make for very difficult and important work. So that certainly would be a good example. How about small businesses? Oh, actually, let me go back to one last question on the nonprofits. Has anyone done studies to track the result of these different approaches to nonprofits and how the nonprofits have done, and whether they had to reduce services, whether some weren't in a position to take any responsive action and went out of business entirely? Has anyone done the follow-up studies to see how they did in various scenarios?
There's very little research on the effects of nonprofits as a result of the minimum wage, owing, I think, largely to the fact that the municipal minimum wage is a relatively new and relatively rare phenomenon. If you raise the minimum wage at the state level, then the reimbursement rate for the nonprofit can be increased as a result of the state level wage. So there isn't a lot of research on this issue.
So the entities that have done it have just taken their best shot and their best guess as to how to most appropriately deal with this.
Yes.
What about small businesses? How did the various areas that have done a municipal minimum wage dealt with small businesses, and did any of them have a floor below which they were exempted, like 5 or fewer employees, 50 or fewer employees?
So there's a range of policies. Rarely is there a wholesale exemption, meaning that no minimum wage has to be paid. More often is there a delay in the implementation, or businesses below a certain either size cutoff or below a certain revenue amount. And when it comes to what type of cutoff, there's a range of approaches. Perhaps the largest cutoff is in Seattle, which delays implementation for all firms that have less than 500 employees. And if the report data and the report speaks very clearly on this, if you do that, a very large fraction of low-wage workers experiences a delay. It is somewhat more likely that the cutoff chosen is lower, between 5 and 10, or
I have
somewhat larger than that.
Yeah, I have it here. San Francisco delayed phase-in for firms with fewer than 10 employees. Seattle for firms with fewer than 500 employees. Santa Fe with fewer than 25. But then they later reversed that in 2007. So there's been a variety of ways in which cities, municipalities have dealt with this issue.
Yeah, 500 obviously would be ridiculous in Los Angeles, because we're such a small business-focused city. That would eliminate a huge.
It was a 1-year delay, if I remember right, in Seattle. So the small businesses, fewer than 500 employees, got to phase in 1 year later, depending on whether or not they paid their employees, also provided their employees non-wage benefits. So there was sort of a two-tier system: size of firm and benefits and no benefits.
So to the extent that that's been discussed, it was an exemption for relatively tiny businesses, of which there are a good number in Los Angeles, but 10 employees, 25 employees.
Right.
And how do we deal with tipped employees? That's still a concern of mine, especially in the restaurant industry, because we have so many restaurants, and we know that they're on relatively small margins. So trying to figure this out and figure out if we can just handle them as everybody else, or whether we'll put a bunch of people out of business. I think that's one of the things we need to sort out. How did other places treat tipped restaurant employees?
My understanding is the state law requires them to be paid at the minimum wage, which is a tipped minimum wage, and there's no tip credit as currently allowed under California law. But I think that's
not an answer to the question,
Right.
and there are opinions on both sides of whether that's actually the case or
Right.
whether there are ways to do it. So what did the places do that had the ability to deal with the issue?
They arrive at a variety of different policy options. One is to engage a full tip credit, and another one is to fully raise the minimum wage for those for those workers who are employed in tipped businesses. And then it just simply becomes a question of how important is tipping in those businesses continue to be.
Anyone do anything in between, or was it just all or nothing?
I'm not aware of anyone that's split the baby.
And how did you look at the impact of residents versus non-residents? Because obviously we're an expensive city. That's part of the problem we're trying to address. Therefore, a lot of folks that are living on $9 an hour or even less with wage theft are obviously not living within our boundaries because we're too expensive. So how does that impact what would otherwise be a very positive impact on our economy? I think, how much is that reduced by the number of residents that won't be LA residents? Do we have a consistent agreement on what the number is and what the impact will be, etc.?
I think about so the Economic Roundtable has a detailed analysis of residential patterns that adds an entire layer of data collection, and they went to considerable trouble to isolate people who work in the city of LA, people who live in the city of LA, and about somewhat more than about half of the people working in the city do not live in the city. So part of their expenditures will occur outside of the city, and part of the benefits in terms of higher wages and the higher expenditure will accrue in the county. And Berkeley's estimates take that into account. There's a feedback effect then from the county to the city, but not the full effect will go to the city.
And that's an estimate for low-wage workers that we're addressing here, as opposed to all city workers.
There's a higher proportion of low-wage workers living in the city among people who work in the city. So an over-proportional amount of the benefit will remain in the city. That's a very good point. But still, there is a substantial amount of wage increase occurring outside of the city. So we're talking
still have
about
some benefit to us, but not quite as much as
well, it is not 100%, but more in the order of 60%.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kretz. Mr. Cedillo.
Thank you, gentlemen. If you could return to the importance of ongoing evaluation and what that also means on wage theft, our ability to monitor that with our local businesses.
This is a critical issue, and it's very, very difficult to monitor non-payment of overtime and off-the-clock work, also known as wage theft. We currently don't have adequate data systems in place to assess who's not being paid for work that they're doing or who's not being paid properly for the hours that they work. If we were to invest in a system that allowed us to track the minimum wage, we could simultaneously gather information on who's not being paid the right wages. We could simply ask what the nature of their work arrangement is, who do they work for, what's their industry, what's their occupation, and make an assessment about whether or not they should be paid overtime and whether they were, or if they work off the work and don't receive pay for the hours that they work, we would also be able to assess that via a survey. But as it stands right now, there's no systematic way to evaluate that. We can look at complaints to the city and things along those lines, but direct quantification of the size of that effect is not currently available.
But it could be available with the type of data we're suggesting, in the sense that both for enforcement as well as for the analysis of wage theft, having individual level data on what people say they worked and what the hourly wage would able to enable us to pin down and say which sectors, which areas, which type of workers might be affected, allowing for a much more targeted enforcement.
And I think we should be careful here. We would want to be cautious in the sense that, people may not always give the best estimates of their own work hours, so we want to be careful about how we go about constructing such an instrument and how we would use it. But I think we have the skills and the capacity to do that as a common data collection method used in the United States.
And the foundation would be then like the state data systems that the state runs through their EDD, and then our business registries, and then augment that with surveys out to the workforce.
Exactly. That's the idea.
Let me ask you, in fact, I'm sure no one has asked this, but, the goal here is to increase the quality of life of all Angelenos, build a bridge between the extraordinarily continuing to grow gap between wealth and poverty. This is a rich city, rich state, rich nation, yet we have tremendous poverty at the same time. Concurrently, coming out of a recession, worst recession since the Depression, we don't want to stifle that. We want this. The goal is that the infusion of more disposable income would then benefit business, right? Particularly a business like ours, very focused on service, entertainment, retail, etc. But one thing no one asked, I don't think you asked or anyone, is thoughts about the impact on the working poor, those who work and also eligible for food stamps, also eligible for child care, also eligible for some health care, also eligible for education training, also eligible for perhaps scholarships that are means-based. No one's looked at that, have we?
So,
yes.
Please, just real quick. The Berkeley study and the Economic Roundtable report have taken that into account from two perspectives. One perspective is many of these workers, if they get a raise from the minimum wage, may not qualify for certain types of services anymore, and that has two implications. On the one hand, the net effect to the total disposable income available to the worker is smaller than the gross effect.
Yes.
And the Berkeley study nicely quantifies that and provides two numbers. One number that just corresponds to the full wage increase due to the minimum wage, and a number that nets out the reduction in services received. And that number is about 25% lower.
25% more?
Lower. So if the wage, say by 2017, the average rise in annual earnings of an affected worker would be 20%. But it would be about 15% approximately if one takes into account that there would be a reduction of services received. There is, in a way, an upside is that there would be cost savings to some of these programs, and many of these programs are run at the state level, some are run at the federal level, some are run at the city level. Now, if that is a concern, it would be interesting, and we talked about complementary program, to look into, does one want to change eligibility criteria for certain programs that the city runs to get a notch up? On the other hand, one loses the cost savings, and then there's the question: at what level do we want workers to be eligible for these programs? But two of the studies explicitly address this issue.
And also the state. I mean, we have, let's say, child care for working families.
There's several, and the state programs have the bigger share.
Right.
So the city is, by raising the minimum wage, is providing some savings to the state. And then the studies quantify that amount of savings.
We may concurrently want to look at raising the eligibility or lowering or syncing up the eligibility requirements so that what was $9 today maybe is another number later, so that they don't lose their child care or lose their Denical or lose their...
If that was a concern, then that would be an option, and certainly it would be interesting to be able to target that. See that it would of course. pity in a way if you raise the wage of working poor such that they don't qualify for childcare, and then they have to spend a large fraction of that wage increase
Right,
on
a large
childcare.
amount.
That's a particularly good example.
Right, we don't want to net loss here.
At what the options are, yeah.
Right, and then I add that to also rent eligibility for subsidized housing, etc.
Yeah, that's another one.
Thank you. I'll see to Mr. Kokorian the rest of my questions.
Mr. Kokorian, another round?
Thank you. Well, you just asked one of them, Mr. Cedillo, so thank you. But I think just to build on that point a little bit, clearly the higher the increase in the minimum wage, the greater the impact on eligibility for social programs, correct? So, since we don't exactly know where that nets out, and we have zero control over eligibility requirements in state and federal programs, by a local minimum wage increase, some portion of the benefit inevitably will be lost to the benefit of the state. Yes, because our workers will lose, they'll gain in wages, but they'll lose benefits. The state budget will be helped, the federal budget will be helped, but we won't get any help from that locally. It'll be a net. It'll be a wash for us locally.
The Berkeley study quantifies that using the eligibility criteria, the average wage increases. So we have a sense of the potential magnitudes.
And at the higher increases,
That's
higher the increase, the more programs will become unavailable to working people in Los Angeles, right?
Exactly.
Okay. I think that dovetails with a point that you made earlier, which I thought was really important. There's two main benefits to a minimum wage increase. One is addressing wage disparity, which rips at the social fabric of any population. But the other is to address directly affordability of being able to live in a place. And we can address the affordability problem in a variety of different ways in addition to minimum wage. Cost reduction, affordable housing, transportation cost reduction, subsidizing utility rates. In any number of different ways we can put a package together that will be beneficial. But we lose some of that ability if some of these programs become unavailable because of the thresholds. So anyway, that's Mr. Cedillo covered that well. I was really interested in...
Hey, how do you like this voice on the commercial,
it as an aside in your report.
Hey, let's let the commercial run.
Issue of
so you can
the greatest degree
what
of job
a bunch
growth
of criminals,
happening,
what bad
not just in small businesses,
they can't
but
even
in
do
new
crimes
businesses.
properly.
And the fact that most
I just think they could learn.
new
Don't they
businesses
deal
are
with
small,
the
it
best criminals
captures
in the
that
world? I
bit,
keep
but,
telling them, do we got to come in there and teach you guys how to be criminals? This is a goddamn joke, huh? See, there it is. You killed Celeste, Walter, my friend Richard Arthur. You assassinated his son to get to Walter. You got everybody to turn on me, including my family. Now it's payback time, people. Legal payback time. Through the system. DOJ. Everyone like that. You people fucked up.